Well, welcome to Silver Lining for Learning. This is episode 19. Thank you so much for joining us, either live or in the archives. My name is Chris Deedy. I'm one of the 5 co-founders of Silver Lining for Learning. I teach at Harvard University. And our other 2 co-hosts for today are Kurt Bonk from Indiana University and Punya Mishra from Arizona State University. We are really excited to have a program about Africa and just, looking forward very much to learning from our 3 guests. Pertulla Ezigha is a gender and human rights activist with a background in political science, and she founded Leap Girl Africa. That's one of the things that she will talk about. Judith Okonkwo is a technology evangelist and business psychologist, and she set up immersive 3D, which is a creation lab. And that is, I think, a better word than maker lab, actually. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. And Toks is a recent graduate of our Technology, Innovation, and Education program at Harvard. She came to us with so much, and hopefully we were able to add a little more as part of that. And I've asked her to be a discussant as well as to talk about her own work because she has a lot of big picture knowledge. So Pertulla is going to go first. We'll take a question, then Judith will take a question, then turn it over to Toks, and then we're going to turn everybody loose and see what happens. So Pertulla, please go ahead and tell us about yourself and your work.
Thank you very much, Chris. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Ketcha Pertulla Ezigha. As Chris earlier said, I am the founder of Leap Girl Africa. Today, I'm going to talk about my work before COVID and after COVID. I just chose to put it that way, before the new normal that we are all in. The work I've been doing so far to promote and improve equal access to quality education and learning in Cameroon has been fulfilling. But however, there is still a lot that needs to be done. First, before the COVID-19 pandemic, Cameroon already had an ongoing crisis that education is being used as a weapon of war because it's still ongoing. Before we thought about, okay, what can we do to be able to help children during this time, because there are children who have stayed out of school for 4 years now. We actually succeeded to move education online by collaborating with Mia Academy, which is an educational app, where we created an educational app that works both online and offline. It was really interesting working on this app because it started at the nursery level, primary level, then it went up to the secondary level, where students are able to find content, they are able to assess themselves, what is their progress so far in education, and keep on relearning without putting their lives at risk. And also with this, parents are able to create that one-on-one relationship with their child and follow up on the evolution of their children. Next, after the pandemic, we saw that the government did their best by moving education online with the use of TVs, with the use of radio. That was great to be able to do that. But there was a problem because the close down of schools, not having a means to be able to monitor and evaluate that, to actually find out if children are following up with this education. So we took upon ourselves to do the ground research on what is happening. We found out that, okay, some parents took this as an opportunity to send their children into the streets to sell, and girls spend more time with chores, with home chores. And this was really heartbreaking. So we decided to bring education to them. It was really another time for fun because we just identify communities like IDP communities in different regions of Cameroon, and we put up amplifier speakers in that community. So whatever chores you're doing, you're able to follow up on the radio or you're able to follow up on the TV, which is very interesting. You don't like disobey your parents. We all know how the African community is, the African society is. You don't disobey your parents, but yet you're still able to pursue your dream, which is gaining education and actually seeing some vision of having a brighter future. So that's just like a summary of what we have been doing so far with Live Your Africa, and in collaboration, of course, with Mia Academy. Thank you.
That's very exciting, and it illustrates a theme in Silver Lining for Learning, which is often people complain that they don't have enough. For some people, unless every child has a supercomputer and 5G connection, they feel that they can't do anything. And all around the world, people are doing wonderful things with far fewer resources, and we really celebrate that. Punya or Kurt, do you have a question for Pertulla?
I think I would love to actually hear.
Punya. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, go ahead, Kurt. That's fine.
It seems like you've experienced the full spectrum of distance learning technologies in a short span of time. But in fact, by having ramped up in online learning before the pandemic, it probably enabled you to do some things that other people, other places, other countries couldn't do or wouldn't have been able to do. What was it like in that transition in Cameroon? And might you have transitioned better because you were doing some things for a couple of years prior to that? And what was the transition like?
For transition, I don't, from our observations or how others have been trying to like transition into the virtual realm, it has not been easy because first, because of internet, and moving your work online is not very evident since you have problems with people accessing Android phones. You have problems with people having a good laptop to be able to work. And not all schools have that privilege to have all these equipments to enable all these resources to help their students have the best quality education that they need. And so there has been struggles, which has to be appreciated, of course, but this COVID has really highlighted that there's still a lot of work to do when it comes to exploring technology and effectively using the internet. Because whenever you still organize educational programs online, you still find out that more people still prefer the phone, just hanging around social media, rather than actually following up these programs, which is very sad. But it's slowly, as we say, they'll get there.
Phone, radio, television, paper pamphlets, pretty much the whole gamut, the wide spectrum is on display there for kids to learn. It's actually, but they're going to be more self-reliant learners in the long run, having relied on the different forms of technology access to education. It's hard today, but I assume you're seeing some of that.
Yes, well, we are seeing.
Yeah, Punya, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just actually one of the things that sort of resonated with what you were saying, and this is part of a side conversation I had, which is on the Silver Lining website with somebody from India, which is the gender disparity, which is like in India, for instance, if a family has a cell phone, if it's for the breadwinner, it's for the parent first, and then it might go, if at all, to the son in the family before it can even reach the daughter. And that's something. So I would, and I think you mentioned that a little bit. I would like to learn a little bit more about how you're addressing that, because that's a significant issue of disparity, even within a family, right? I mean, it's not even across families; it's within families.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so our target so far has been internally displaced persons, as we already started working with people from the Northwest, internally displaced persons from the Northwest and Southwest. We were trying to get refuge in some of these regions from the ongoing crisis. So what we have been doing is identifying some families who have been able to group a high number of students, a high number of families into their homes, because sometimes you can find 10 to 15 people living in a house. So I think to address this, we have been providing radios, at least to one per family, which they are able to like keep up with their lessons, and like educating the parents too on that. They're able to know that, okay, there's this equal access to education. And also not giving parents the chance to choose between selecting who has to go to school and who does not have to go to school through empowerment, because we also believe that dependency leads to vulnerability. When we are able to empower these families, they are economically fine, so they are able to take care of the education. And you see, these girls don't become vulnerable to marriages because their parents are able to pay their school fees, you see.
Judith,
Thank you.
tell us about your work.
Thank you, Chris. I'm just going to share a screen so I can share some images while I speak. Okay, can everybody see the screen all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I run a creation lab in Lagos, Nigeria called immersive 3D. And the work that we're doing is focused on developing the ecosystem for the extended reality technology, so augmented and virtual reality and mixed reality, here in Nigeria and across the African continent. We're very passionate about making sure that here locally, we can both start to adopt and adapt these technologies for our own purposes. So the kind of like drive with that, this was work we started in 2016, and it really was a move to join this shift of a narrative from being consumers of technology to becoming creators, so that we could start to build what we need. And this is just an image from one of the hackathons that we ran in our first year, getting the hackers locally to create solutions for education, among other topics, with virtual reality. Now, one of the areas that we have been very passionate about applying immersive technology is education, because as I'm sure several of you know, in Nigeria, we have quite a few problems in the educational sector, from having the highest number of out-of-school children in the world, right through to overpopulation in the school system, infrastructure that's dated, learning outcomes that are not quite meeting expectations. We very early on decided that we wanted to start to introduce VR into the school system in every way that we could. Now, we would approach this from a number of ways. We opened up our labs so students could come, and this is from the secondary and tertiary institutions. We, spent quite a bit of time going to different events, and we would particularly target going into the public school system, because this was a sector where traditionally they wouldn't be able to afford access to the technologies. And then, following this, we started to think about ways in which we might be able to actually bring these technologies into the school as a tool, as a learning aid that can be used to supplement the teaching. Now, for us, the reality was that in a typical public school, you could easily have, 70 to 80 students in one classroom. And, this is with the basic infrastructure. So it'll be a table, chair, and a blackboard. And without, the labs that you would expect for the sciences or funds for things like field trips, we knew that the learning experiences were limited for the students. How could we enhance this? And I proposed that if we could put VR labs in schools, then we would be able to start to provide experiences that could, supplement for these gaps. You could, if the right content was created, have virtual labs. You could obviously have the children, go on field trips, explore the pyramids, the solar system. We were fortunate a few years into our work to have the opportunity to work with UNICEF to create content specifically for the Nigerian curriculum. And this is work that we started to do with a local public school in Yaba in Lagos, the commercial capital. We, in the school, identified a teacher group, 10 teachers who were especially passionate about the technologies. And this image is of the group of teachers who would come to our lab. We introduced them to technology, to virtual reality. We got them to try it out, to give us feedback. And we started to speak with them to ask, how do you think this might be able to help you in the classroom? How would it help you improve things for your students? Fortunately for us, there was a lot of engagement. The teachers really enjoyed it. And then they started to explore the different subjects where they thought it would have the greatest impact. In the end, we decided to focus on 3 subjects: mathematics, physical and health education, and basic science, to create our initial series of content. So we started the work, and this is, the students in the school trying out virtual reality experiences. So just a little bit about the process that we adopted. We were very keen to have the kind of immersive content that would be relatable to the students. When we first started going into the school system to work with VR, we didn't actually have our own locally created content. We had just curated content that was freely available because we were working with very limited resources. But for this particular project, we then went ahead to make sure that we would create an environment that was realistic for the students, that had things they could recognize, like the Okada, which you can see in the image, which is the motorcycle taxi that is prevalent on the streets of Lagos, the kind of trees and fruits and things that you would see in your everyday life. We also introduced peer guides as an element of these virtual reality experiences. We wanted these students to be, the peer guides to be relatable to the students. There are 3 children, Ejike, Morenike, and Niat, from the 3 major ethnic groups in Nigeria, who would then be the ones sharing information for the students in the VR experiences. And then in terms of our approach to development, we took an agile approach where we were working hand in hand with the teachers. It was a co-creation process. So they helped us identify the subjects to focus on. We had our researchers spend time in the school with them, observing them in the classroom, learning about their pain points, looking at their class notes and understanding how best they would like to integrate this. We would then take this knowledge back to the lab. We would develop, and then we would come back and do some testing. And this is a user test happening with one of the students at the school. Once we had finished kind of like the iterations and had a first version ready to go, we were then ready to set up. We created a VR learning lab guide for the teachers and students. And this was a little booklet, just kind of like reintroducing them to the technology again and getting them comfortable with using the space that we had set up. We then went ahead to start running orientation sessions for the students in the space that we had set up for them, and then have started to introduce this experience into the classroom as a complement to the traditional teaching that they're having. So, that's kind of like where we were, and then things got paused with the pandemic. But we're now going to go ahead as the school year starts. The current expectation is that schools will be open again in August. And we're now going to go into a pilot phase where we want to be able to demonstrate the return on investment of actually introducing VR into the school, and to demonstrate what the impact is on learning outcomes for the students. Okay, that's it for me.
Well, Judith, thank you. And please unshare your screen so we can see everybody.
Absolutely.
One of the things I would note is that we see between the 2 experts something we really strive for in educational technology, which is to have a low floor and a high ceiling. We want a low floor so that no one is excluded, even though they've been marginalized by society. We want a high ceiling because we don't want to have a glass ceiling that holds down any group or any nation in terms of the potential of its peoples. So that's great. Kurt, Punya, any questions, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Judith. And a couple of questions that I'm going to pick up from the chat that's been going on the Facebook Live. It's a pretty active chat going on there. So I'm going to combine two questions. So one was, how did you identify these teachers? And sort of a follow-up to that, I think from Priyank in India, was how did the teachers respond to this? Was there resistance? Was there like sort of excitement? How did that piece play out? And if I can add one more layer to it, which is how do you see this expanding in the future, right? So how did you get to the teachers? How did they respond, and what's next? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Panil, for the questions. So the first question, how did we identify the teachers? We actually worked with the principal and the vice principal of the school to identify the teachers. So once we explained to them what we wanted to do, that we actually wanted to develop content specifically for them, and that we were looking at driving adoption throughout the school, we asked who it would be best to collaborate with, and they went ahead and selected a range of teachers from different subjects. So, math teachers, English teachers, basic science, basic technology, a whole range. And then going on to the next question, in terms of the reaction of the teachers, it was actually overwhelmingly positive. So I was really pleased about that. And I think that's a reaction that we typically tend to see with, immersive technology and virtual reality. Once you put on the headset, you get all sorts of really engaged reactions. And we certainly had that. But one thing I did appreciate, there were a few teachers who enjoyed it very much, but they were like, this is fantastic. But I have to ask, how in the world is this going to work? We've got huge class sizes. We've got very limited periods. How are we going to be able to navigate this? Even just looking at a process of getting students from their regular classroom to a lab, into a head, that sort of thing. So there were those kinds of challenges, which, we found very exciting because it was helping us to think through a process that we thought we could then, start to create a framework that might work beyond like this particular class and this particular school, which kind of leads me to your final question about kind of like where we see this going. So we're very passionate about, not just creating these virtual reality experiences, but also actually demonstrating that this is an option for creating a learning aid that will improve learning outcomes. Because one thing that you'll probably know is that there was a lot of emphasis on getting more students into school, but there wasn't commensurate effort in terms of like the quality coming out of the school. And so we definitely have a significant issue there. And if this technology can help us start to bridge the gap between where the majority of the population is in the public school system and what we have in the elite private schools, then it will be a real service to, both the children and the future of our country. So the hope is that we'll be able to do this pilot test, determine the impact on learning outcomes, and make the case to be able to scale this widely across all schools.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Kurt, do you have a question?
No, I think this is your expertise, Chris. I'm sure you have something you want to follow up with.
Well, I just want to point out that all of these technologies that used to be exotic are really becoming quite available because augmented reality is based on mobile devices. We saw headsets that could be, empowered by mobile devices. Mobile devices are becoming more and more powerful. And one of the things that I've said publicly a lot is I think the first truly 21st century educational system is going to come in the global South. It's not going to come in the global North countries. The global North countries have all these people heavily invested in industrial education who are going to fight to the death not to have it change into something better suited to the 21st century. But the global South countries have the opportunity to leapfrog the developed countries, the global North nations, I think, and technologies that depend on mobile devices are an ideal method. So mobile devices can do radio, they can do television, they can do internet, they can do augmented reality. It's a very rich opportunity. So Toks, please feel free to talk about your own work, but also your perspective as a discussant, about Africa writ large and ways to think about this work, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's just, it's really fascinating, Petrulla and Judith's work. I mean, it's every time I hear what you're doing, I'm still like, wow. I mean, for Petrulla, getting education out to children who are supposed to be doing chores and and are facing all kinds of difficulties. I think it's really great. And one thing that I maybe distinguish between your work, Petrulla, and Judith's work is that they're both aiming to bridge this digital divide, right? That COVID has really kind of exposed and exacerbated for us. So where Petrulla's work is, okay, if we don't have the devices and we don't have, if we don't have, the mobile phones and all of those things, how else can we still get education out so that it's still of good quality and children aren't missing out and they're learning without their lives being at risk, I think is the term that you used. And that is so critical. And I think it draws on what Chris was saying about, the low floor and making sure that, there's nothing low enough that will prevent us from getting the education out there, which is the most important thing. But then this other strategy of, regardless of the lack of resources that we have and the fact that, it's, in these public schools, for example, it's literally bare bones equipment. I mean, the pictures you showed us, Judith, it's just like tables and chairs and that's it. That's the ICT, that's the like tech lab in the school. And yet, regardless of that, we're still building, using the most sophisticated technologies to get them their education. At I'm assuming an affordable rate, at least starting to get more and more affordable. And we're really seeing kind of more of both of those strategies all across the continent. And that's what's very exciting, is, I've got a couple of examples for you. Out in Ethiopia, there's an organization called Be Blocky, and they've been working with mobile devices, as Chris was mentioning, using AR to help children with coding, to teach children coding. And, this is, I mean, Be Blocky isn't new. It's not something that came up, as a result of COVID. It's been around for, I think, a good 3 or 4 years now. And so, these kinds of technologies it's just as long as you have the smartphone, and you don't need very much more than that. And although smartphone penetration isn't great yet, it's certainly not the majority across Africa, but it's still, in the hands of people who they would be in public school education and their education, the quality of, they wouldn't have access to coding classes, for example, through school. So I think, that's also fantastic. And if I can think of one or two more, out in Zambia, and I can drop links to these if anyone wants to know more. But out in Zambia, they're also doing some great work. There's an initiative called the Can't Wait to Learn initiative that's across countries like Uganda, Lebanon, Sudan, Jordan, Chad, Bangladesh, and they're working on collaborative design for kids, which is, again, really, really fantastic. And they target children in war afflicted areas. And so there really is kind of no bar to where we can get really good quality education out, especially when we're leveraging these technologies well, which is really what's very, very exciting for me. So do we have some questions from the
Yeah, we have one question, and I'll make a comment and then bridge into the question.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found very powerful about what we've been talking about so far is creating a curriculum that the children can relate to, They see contexts that are their context. They see peers who are from their particular group. That's so important because in education, if you can't find yourself in the curriculum, then it's not going to matter to you. You have to see yourself in it. And so I applaud UNICEF, Judith, as I understand it, that instead of just giving you a curriculum, which is unfortunately what happens all too often, they said, here's resources to create your curriculum, which makes a lot of sense. Can any of you say a little bit more about what you see funders doing now to help with the opportunities you've been describing, and what you'd like to see more of from funders that maybe isn't happening so far?
I'll go ahead and comment first, if that's all right. So one thing I would say, I mean, so the support from UNICEF came via the UNICEF Innovation Fund, which specifically looks at supporting initiatives using emerging technologies across UNICEF's program countries for initiatives that are targeted at children. And it's fantastic that that fund exists, at least with the little bit that it can provide to get people started. But one thing that I think we've certainly seen on the continent is that there's been a huge rise, certainly over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, in terms of, organizations coming out and saying that they focus on educational technology. And alongside that, we're now starting to see, a few more accelerators focusing on kind of like nurturing these startups. But when it comes to, technologies that are particularly focused startups that are particularly focused on emerging technologies, I think that the support is still limited. If I think about what's needed, for example, to really develop and scale in the way that we would want to with our project, then we would like to see a lot more substantial funding coming our way. So I think if there's one thing that, we want to, say, it's that we're keen to attract more funding. We're especially keen to do so because we see the opportunity of these technologies for allowing us to then start to kind of like shift some of the current kind of like paradigms that have existed and maybe haven't played out so well in our school systems. I'll give you one example in Nigeria. It's been a big thing to, go digital and introduce computer labs into schools. So there's definitely been an initiative by the government to put computer labs in a few schools, which on the surface seems like a fantastic idea. However, if you know kind of like the nitty-gritty of living in Nigeria, then you might know that electricity from the grid is not reliable, which means that often those computers can't be used. Now, that investment that you put into having a computer lab is not going to get you all of the returns that you had planned for. If conversely, it's put into mobile device-driven VR or all-in-one VR, which is still, virtual reality at a level that can be charged by a solar portable, then you have learning devices that can be used regardless of the electricity infrastructure. So I think that, we need to perhaps take a more systemic approach to the funding and look at, initiatives that are coming from different sectors, even from, sectors like energy, that might come in to support some of the work that we're doing that is taking a more sustainable approach to making sure everybody can get quality education.
Yeah, I think if I can jump in, Pertulla, I think you're absolutely right, Judith. And one of the things for me that I would certainly like to see is more support in the teaching profession, and just we need to get to a point where the teaching profession itself is elevated in its image in society, so that it really becomes attractive, because you know the saying about like, it doesn't matter how great the technology is, it's only great tech when it's in the hands of great teachers, right? Or it's only as great as the teacher who's using it. And I think that's one of the things that's a bit of a hindrance is really the teachers that we have, and making sure that they have the support. So I think that's one thing that I would like to see, like across everywhere, but certainly across the continent. Yeah.
So Pertulla, we have a question for you from the audience. And I just want to begin by saying how important your work is, because one of the biggest mistakes any country can make is gender discrimination, because you've eliminated half of your talent pool. I mean, talk about a fatal error. That is just huge. So our audience is asking, beyond using the technology for education itself, are there ways that you're using the technology to create support networks and to extend the reach of what you're doing with Leap Girl Africa?
Thank you very much for that question. For what we are doing to create support networks, it's mostly like before COVID, we had a small office where there are a few laptops and computers. We are able to train girls on how to use these devices. But right now online, what we are doing is an adolescent initiative for reform, where we are actually training girls on how to be able to identify policies that discriminate against them and identify some of the laws that discriminate against them. Now, we build their capacities on how to be able to work on reforming these policies. Because if we keep on saying, okay, girls need to be represented or youth needs to be represented, and they don't actually have the capacities in able to raise their voices in a good way that actually makes changes, then we are not getting somewhere. That's why we have that peer-to-peer exchange programs where we are training them on different ways on how to actually read documents and identify some of the cliches or some of the problems in these documents. And for the previous questions on how funders have been working, yes, we have been getting some support, but it's actually really minimal. You know, as a young woman too, it's not very easy because sometimes to be able to receive a grant or to receive funds, you're being judged by your age, and sometimes that trust is being identified according to your youth age, which is not very good. You can see what some youths are doing when they have access to few resources. Imagine giving them access to full resources, what they can be able to do. So we should actually surpass that level of this is a girl, this is an adolescent girl. We should look at their capacities. What do they have in them and what can they give out? And some of the processes to enable people to get funds are kind of long, and it limits grassroots women or young-led organizations or men-led organizations that are working. There are some small groups in the villages that are doing so much work, they don't have access to these funds because the processes are so extensive and they don't have that ability to be able to go through it.
Yeah.
Yes, and thank you, Pertulla, for that. And I want to follow up with just something that you said before, and this is a question from the audience, so it seems like a nice segue here, which has to do with what kinds of, and Judith, jump in after that, please, around sort of policy level decisions that you think need to be made, because those are sort of structural changes, which then can, if you're looking at groups or individuals doing exciting work, but if the system or the structure is not shifted, that work doesn't sustain. So can you speak a little bit about that? And then Judy, please jump in once she's done.
Okay, on policies, what we usually focus on is sexual reproductive health and gender-based violence, because we believe that at that level, if they are not well, if girls don't maybe have access to be able to have a contraceptive, then she's not able to have full control over her body, which still goes on to her not being able to determine if her future should take full control or not.
Thank you so much, because I think that's great. No, because the point is that that education and technology exist within a broader social context, and I think I mean, I had a comment early on before the show started, and I'm just going to put it out there, and I think we can come back to it later, which has to do with us looking at Africa as being a thing, a sort of a unitary thing, while actually within it are so many different cultures, governments, systems, and the solutions have to be customized for each of those. And so any policy recommendation that emerges, I mean, this is a very colonial view of seeing this entire continent as being one thing. When it's not, it is many different people, many different cultures, and and systems and so on, right? So I think I'd love for us to come back to that. But before that, Judith, anything around the policy stuff? But I would really love to have a little bit of discussion on the sort of diversity within this amazing continent, which I don't think we often talk about.
Yeah.
Thank you. So from the policy perspective, so I think in a few ways, we would like to really see policy influence to be able to create a much more enabling environment for the immersive technologies to thrive. I think that if we're going to be able to realize the potential of these technologies to tackle things like education, then a lot more has to be done to support that. If the situation, in a lot of African countries, especially sub-Saharan Africa, access to the hardware is particularly difficult. Whatever it will cost in the West, you can expect to double or triple that cost to make it available locally. And even at a time like this, for example, when the supply chain was disrupted because of the pandemic, even more impossible. So I think, definitely looking at government to create a much more enabling environment through policy for people to invest in the technologies locally, for people to start businesses around it, to drive the kind of local content creation that will match, so that we're having, as Chris was mentioning, relatable content for our students. I also think that we need to invest in the technology much more generally, just so we can start to kind of like educate and develop skills at the level that we require to be able to be competitive in the world of the future. So I think much around, enabling business and, funding for development of skills, research and development would be my take on this.
Kurt, do you have points, thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things have come to mind in all these discussions that are going on. And as people evaluate the different projects that they've talked about, I'm wondering whether certain things surface, certain things come up, like your Can't Wait to Learn, you talk about collaborative design. And I've been researching recently a project called Fundy for kids 8 to 15 years old in Africa, creating wiki pages based on things in their local environments and getting them to negotiate knowledge, if you will. And Judith is a technology evangelist, but she wants to create ecosystems for learning. So I'm wondering if we take the ecosystem side of it for a second, and Toks wants to create professional development for applied behavior analysis. I'm wondering whether either of those two could talk about, what principles arise when you create professional development programs for teachers, or when you create your ecosystems. What things could you tell policymakers in the government that are replicable, that are things that do work? You've seen work, and that you could create an ecosystem for learning in another with another initiative. What would you go to them with? What would you tell them? Toks, Judith, with either one, or Pertulla, either.
Shall I jump in, Toks?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
So first I thought about when you were talking, so please go ahead.
Okay. All right. So one approach that we've been taking with our work in developing the ecosystem is providing access. We wanted to kind of like reduce that disparity because it very easily, it could have become something with this technology that was only accessible to the elite. So the approach that we took was to create labs. And we now have them in 8 Nigerian cities. And these are spaces where you can come in, you can access the technology, for free. You can get support if you want to engage with them. And this has done a number of things for us. Apart from this being a way in which, students, particularly at the tertiary level, could come and engage and get to have your first touch and feel of the technology. It's also spurred a lot of people who decided to go into the field and start to create specifically with immersive technology. for me, the creation of labs and access points really for the technologies, the way I would describe them, means that as you would see with like tech communities traditionally, a community will start to form around this focal point. So you'll have learning groups start to emerge, meetups will start to happen, knowledge sharing will start to happen, and that transfer really starts to build a foundation for the ecosystem. So if there was one thing that I would really encourage, the government to invest in would be to create more of these spaces where we're saying, we will give you access to these technologies, we will support your first step in.
That's great. Toks or Pertulla, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Just very quickly. Yeah, I think that one thing I've seen working, or one thing I've seen with working with teachers is that they're keen. So it's interesting because in certainly the cases in Nigeria, people don't tend to go into the teaching profession as a first choice. So it's typically, you didn't get into your first or second choice degree, so here's the fallback. Or while you're looking for a job, you've graduated, there's no work, there's no employment, you go into something called the National Youth Corps. So it's like a skills development kind of 1 year core program. And through that, you might get dumped in a school and get told to, to sit in front of some kids. And then when you're done with that program, there's still no work. So you just stay there. And then 20 years later, you're still a teacher. That's actually the truth for a large percentage of teachers certainly in Nigeria, and I've heard in other African countries as well. And so I think that when you bring some information about, how the teaching practice can be better or how you can be more effective as a teacher, when you do that, teachers they very much want to know. They're keen, even though this isn't what they chose. You'll find that they want to help the kids at the end of the day. Everyone wants to see the children develop. And so I think if we can be better at grabbing the individuals, as lots of like little organizations, NGOs, doing great work and trying to do advocacy and trying to, that have skills and expertise. If the government can do a better job of gathering those NGOs and small private institutions and use that to really build the capacity of the public system, I think that would just have a huge impact. Because I know that even for me, for example, with my small organization, I went into a small community in Lagos and just gathered went to a couple of the public schools and was talking about special education needs and children with disabilities. And we had, I planned for about 20 teachers, and we had over like 120 teachers over 2 weekends. It was fantastic. And, they're just so keen, and they want to know why this information hasn't been provided before, why, why haven't we come to their schools before? And, why don't they get this training? And I just think that, that's one thing that I think would be really great, is if we could just focus some energy in actually supporting the teachers and just start at the basics. You don't have to go very high.
This reminds me that I should, sorry to cut you up, that I have a former student who might be sitting in the chat, and I want to say hi to Etiano Adala, who worked for the African Virtual University, creating programs for teacher training and using open OER and doing evaluation across 8 countries in Africa. And so if she's there, thanks for joining us.
That's the thing, private organizations, small organizations like that are doing fantastic work. Ministries of education just need to grab a hold of it and really, empower what they're doing.
Well, that's a great bridge, Toks, to what I want to talk about next. As always, our time is rapidly evaporating, but I want to build on themes that both Kurt and Punya introduced. One of the things that we do in Silver Lining for Learning is not only to celebrate successes, but to look at ways that they might transfer to other places, because too often there's a non-invented here attitude about what happens in education when there are tremendous ideas, models, solutions that are already out there if you're just willing to pay attention to them. And as Punya indicated, Africa is very rich, very diverse, very rich in its cultural heritages. And so an interesting question is, are there venues by which people can talk across groups, across regions, across countries within Africa and share some of the kinds of successes that you're talking about? For example, I get email from a group called eLearning Africa. Is that an example of something like this, or would you like to see a different example emerge?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think that there are, again, like these organizations like eLearning Africa that are fantastic. But I would like to see, for example, the African Union, you know, and those bigger international organizations. I'd like to see those become a platform for cross collaboration, and they certainly are for some sectors. But I'd like to see, you know, again, a bigger focus in the education space across those kind of very big NGOs, international organizations like the African Union. Because I mean, their mandate is certainly, you know, one Africa and unity in spite of our diversity, or because of our diversity, you know, being able to learn from each other. So I'd certainly like to see more out of that kind of organization.
And also there are few that I know that are like exchange programs where we also get to work online, like the award, that we are working currently on, a toolkit for education to study different regions in Africa and actually put our experiences together, bring up this toolkit to guide people on how to manage, if it's in time of crisis, how do you actually manage that and keep up with education? If it's in normal times, how do you actually manage that and keep up with education? They are exchange programs like that, and where we also get to exchange our experiences, what has worked, what has not worked, what made it not to work. And there is also this, I think, if I'm not forgetting, it's called, okay, like what we are doing with the Commonwealth Youth Gender and Equality Network, SIGEN, coming all together, saying what to address exactly. This is a pressing issue in this region. We all team up together, bring out a project and work to address this issue. Then you get to deal with a multinational dimension point of view and work on it. I don't know if this answers the question.
Yeah. So one of the things that I would note, and again, this is a constant theme on the program, that we're in the middle of a terrible human tragedy with the pandemic, and yet at the same time, it opens up opportunities that were not there before, and that may disappear unless we're careful when the pandemic recedes. And I think there are interesting opportunities economically as well as educationally. Global South countries know that investing in education is the best way to succeed economically. And they also, if they're looking at the data, know that investing in mobile devices that can be both economic engines and educational engines is a very powerful way of developing, because the rate of return is so high. You put in $1 into mobile devices and you generate much more than that in terms of economic and educational activity. And I do think that because the global North businesses and economies have been disrupted by the pandemic, there's an opportunity here, an uncertainty, that if the global South countries are smart and nimble, could open up ways of developing their economies. But you've got to have the education and you've got to have the infrastructure, as we've discussed, in order to be able to do that. So I want to give each of you a chance to take about a minute and just give a closing thought that you'd like to share with the audience.
Yeah, I can go. All right, I think, thank you, first of all, everyone, for joining, for listening, and for, contributing to this conversation, of course. And thank you both, Judith and Pertulla. I still can't get over the work that you do. I think it's just incredible. I think the silver lining for me is really that in spite of the difficulties, the lack of resources that we face, the pandemic and everything, even for some children with special needs, it's a very, very small number, but a very small number of children in Nigeria, at least, are still getting learning. They're still getting access to learning. And that's because one or two individuals are dedicated to making sure that that happens, and they'll go out of their way. So, therapists will move in to the family's home, into a student's home, just so that they don't have to, cross, and so they can be there 24 hours to provide, help for these kids. I've seen that with my own eyes over the last few months, and I think that that's amazing. Yeah, and what Judith and Pertulla are doing are also exemplars of that kind of dedication to children. So it gives me hope to keep going. Despite everything.
Judith, you have a closing thought?
Yes. So, just kind of like echoing Toks, thank you all so much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure to discuss our work, to hear about the fantastic things going on. Pertulla, your stuff is incredible. And I also kind of like just want to leave one final thought, because, and this is kind of like building on something that you said, Chris, during this discussion, which was there's an opportunity to leapfrog, with both the pandemic and with these technologies. And I think that is something that, really needs to be highlighted as often as we can, because I often tell people that if we look at education, the situation in a country like Nigeria, even if we were to dedicate, in my opinion, all of our budget to education today, we would not be able to utilize traditional means to solve the crisis that we have. We would not suddenly build enough schools. We would not suddenly train enough teachers. Like, it would not be possible. We must leverage technology. We must. We have to find a way that works for us, but we must do it. And, I just, would really like to, first of all, as Toks has been saying, really kind of like highlight the incredible teachers all over, the country who, against incredible odds, are still delivering for students. So the school that I'm doing this work in, the student population is over 1,000 students. One teacher, like one class is like, 70, 80, 90 students. That is not unusual. And that's one teacher dealing with that, several periods a day. I think it's incredible. So everything that we can do to support them with technology, I feel is something that we must do to ensure the future that we need.
Pertulla?
Thank you so much for inviting me. Toks, thank you for the amazing things that you're doing. Judith, I was so glad to hear from you the work that you're doing. You really inspired me. And the MIA Academy app will be moving to Nigeria and Rwanda and Ghana. I really be glad to see how to work together. And I would just want to tell the audience that you must not reach the whole world before you know that you're actually doing something. We can just start from our neighborhoods, and putting our neighborhoods together is going to actually create the impact that we need in our communities. And secondly, I want to say don't overwhelm yourself. It can be so much dealing with COVID. It can be so much looking at someone doing an online course and you want to follow in the trend. Take your time, take a breath, rest from all the information that we are getting from COVID and see how to cope. And next, I also want to plead with us if we can put our efforts together to plead our governments not to touch the budget on education, which is already limited for children. If they can, we know that COVID has affected a lot of our economies, but please let's not touch our budgets, which are already limited on education. Thank you.
Thank you. Young, do you want to introduce our show for next week?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. That was a wonderful show. I learned so much. Thank you so much to Judith and Toks and Pertulla. So for next week, as we know, silver lining for learning is always looking for innovative things that educators have been trying to do or inspire in educational systems. It's about transformation. It is really about how technology can help or not help and understanding. So next week, we're going from Africa to Australia. We found Greg Whitby is an amazing leader. Greg is the executive director of the Parramatta Catholic education system, which is quite a large system, has many schools, and that's on the outskirts of Sydney. Greg is also author. His most recent book is The Generation Wi-Fi. Greg also writes for the Daily Telegraph, which is syndicated to 30-some local newspapers. And so he's a leader of a school system. He knows what has happened, what's happening over there. He's an author, he's a writer, and he's also a teacher. So there's a lot to share. So I'm hoping next week, Greg is going to bring us to some very, very exciting new ideas that can happen, that should happen in Australia and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. Stay safe.
Thank you.